We also want to say thank you. We've got a couple sponsors on this session, so the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences and also the UA Institute for the Study of Religion and Culture helped to bring John out, so we're really grateful to them. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over and get a good discussion started. Thanks.
Good morning.
Hello.
How good. See, y'all are nice and awake on a Sunday morning.
I know.
So my name is Tyina Steptoe, and I'm a professor in the Department of History here at U of A. And I'm very pleased to welcome John Jennings, who's joining us at the Book Fest this weekend. He's a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California, Riverside. And last spring, he was awarded the very prestigious Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellowship at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. His work, which we'll be hearing a lot more about this morning, includes an award-winning essay collection he co-edited called The Blacker the Ink: Constructions of Black Identity in Comics and Sequential Art. And today we're especially going to talk about his graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's novel, Kindred. And there are some plans to keep moving with Octavia Butler's work, which I'm really interested in hearing more about. And he adapted this work with partner Damian Duffy. So thank you, John, for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Tyina. I appreciate it. You guys are probably more awake than I am. I'm like, this is my life. Oh, my God. I was just saying, I was just at South by Southwest a couple of days ago, and then before that, well, after that, like I just did this thing at CSUN at California State University Northwood like yesterday. So I've been like bouncing around, and anyway, but yeah, thank you for having me. Seriously, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So did you want me to? Where do you want me to start?
Well, you're a professor and an artist.
Yes.
So why don't you start by telling us how those two things came together for you?
Okay. Well, I'm from the South originally. I'm from Mississippi, born and raised. Grew up about 15 minutes outside of Jackson, Mississippi, and so I came up, in kind of post-civil rights Mississippi, and I came up in the sticks. So I grew up like in a very isolated, kind of agrarian space, kind of financially challenged, if you know what I mean. And so coming up black and poor in Mississippi post-civil rights era, in a still very segregated space, actually. And my mother went to Alcorn State University for literature, and she was really into like science fiction and fantasy and horror, like super early. Like she was just like, always dreaming about this stuff. And so I just kind of like picked it up from her. And my grandmother actually, I think, was probably like a root worker. She was always talking about these different things that I now see through my research relate to conjure culture, right? So, or root working, hoodoo, if you will. Not voodoo, which is not the religion, but hoodoo, the collection of practices that are connected to different types of folk magic. So anyway, so those things, so imagine me being this little, really like visually oriented kid growing up with a mother who was like dreaming of all these different things. I used to literally like crawl on top. I know this sounds really like Norman Rockwell-ish-esque, but I used to literally like crawl on top of a barn, which my mom would hate, and I would literally like stargaze. I would actually like wonder like what is out there, what's going on out there, what is beyond this forest and all these animals and beetles and things that I would collect, and I started drawing at a very early age, actually. I think I probably could draw before I could like really write. I distinctly remember, and it breaks my heart to think about this now, busting open my mother's like Otis Redding album. I know. I should have been flogged. And drawing a really badly rendered image of the mighty Thor on the inside of the album cover, right? But I was always really visually oriented. Like I was always really into like symbolism and like colors. And little did I know that I was actually kind of attracting the skill set of a graphic designer. So for the last 20 years or so, I've taught graphic design on the college level, right? And so this switch over to media studies is fairly recent. I just started teaching media studies, but I was always really interested in various modes of identity politics. So, right now, of course, we're looking at it as being very intersectional idea politics, right, around race, class, gender, religious practices. and how all these different kind of constructions play off of each other, right? And little did I know that that was what my work was going to be. So it's interesting because, you know, I was always an avid reader. The library, any librarians in the audience, by the way? Thank you. Seriously, because y'all helped me dream myself out of that space. Seriously, I really appreciate that. I would go to the library constantly. I read voraciously, and I started making a lot of work like super early as a kid. I started doing comics. My mother actually introduced me to my first comic books, right? So like Spider-Man, Mighty Thor, and my favorite, Daredevil. I just love Matt Murdock. I love Daredevil. Little did she know she was actually like creating this really obsessive little kid that was going to actually like try to draw these things, right? So I actually started trying to draw my own cartoons really super early. And ironically, though, I didn't end up going into art school super early. I actually went to the military first. My mom was like, this is a cool hobby, you know, this is cool. You're good in school, you know, why don't you become a doctor or a lawyer or something, you know? Right? Why would you want to be an artist? She literally told me I'm going to cut off my ear and die in a box. That's what she said to me. See what she said, seriously. You're going to cut off your ear. She like combined like Basquiat and Van Gogh. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so what ends up happening is I went to the military at 17. I was in a car accident in the military. I actually broke my right foot. You know, thank God, actually. I have like a piece of steel on my third metatarsal. No, it does not set off the metal detectors. And it turns out that I, you know, was able to get a scholarship to Jackson State. And honestly, that was a really, really important aspect for me because that's when I realized your parents don't know everything, you know? I was like, and so from then on, I started doing cartoons. I got a job right out of school at the Clarion Ledger, working as an illustrator. But it wasn't really enough for me. I wanted more, so I actually ended up going to graduate school at the University of Illinois. And my first master's is in art education. And I got a studio degree in design because I realized that what I was drawing as a cartoonist wasn't really what Marvel and DC was doing. And so I kind of let it go a little bit, unfortunately, you know. And I just became interested in like how images socialize us and that kind of thing. And from there, I went into, you know, just teaching full on. And let's see, I was the first African-American professor of art to get tenure at the University of Illinois in 2008. Yeah, all right. And thank you. I appreciate that. And then from there, I was recruited to teach semiotics and graphic design at University of Buffalo. And then I got recruited to teach out at UCR. So that's kind of like my weird roadmap of kind of like how I ended up doing this stuff. But I fell back into comics, I want to say in like 2001 or so, when I realized that you could actually like publish things like printing on demand. You really don't need to ask for permission anymore to publish books, you know? And so my background is in, guess what? Book design. So I actually could write, illustrate, and design my own books and put it out. And so that's actually what got me back into these notions of like various levels of agency and such, yeah. So that's my very long-winded answer to your question. Sorry. You can tell I'm a professor, right? I be professing.
Used to talking, right?
You know what I'm saying? Anyway. All right. And it's coffee, too. So
and I'm wondering, so you left Mississippi, obviously,
yes.
But I'm wondering about how Mississippi has remained part of your work in terms of how it inspired you to get involved in speculative fiction and to keep race central to your work.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I didn't grow up with my dad in the house, but he definitely was. It's a long story, but he eventually found me. It's weird, and I ended up like introducing me to the rest of my family, to my paternal side of my family, and my dad was kind of a pool shark. So he was actually like, he would be in like blues spaces a lot, like juke joints and such. So I actually kind of like grew up, you know, listening to the blues and also going to, you know, church on Sunday and listening to gospel, and also trying to understand like the balance between like the sacred and the profane to a certain degree, right? So you're basically in both of those spaces. Like you'd be in a juke joint one Saturday, and then like, you know, Sunday you'll be, you know, singing praises.
Exactly.
Y'all do that too?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Be out kicking it, and it's like, okay, well, let me get right. I think, I mean, I'm always thinking about what it means to be Southern, in the space. You know, to me, you know, a lot of the ghosts, if you will, or the bones of our country, the things we don't like to talk about a lot of times actually live in spaces in the South, you know. Just to remind people, you know, my ancestors were not immigrants. You know, my immigrants, you know, they were not immigrants. They were captives. And so that kind of notion of like how trauma affects me, I think I've always carried. And it started to affect how I looked at aesthetics and design. There's not a lot of graphic designers who are African American who are teaching on the college level. Like I said, I was the first to actually get tenure, like I said. And so I'm always trying to figure out, well, what is the aesthetic that I'm working with? Like, how are these things related, you know? And of late, there's been like a resurgence in what has been called Afrofuturism. You know, so the term was coined in like 1993 by a professor named Mark Derry. And he was looking at like how African Americans utilize cyber culture in this burgeoning thing called the World Wide Web. You guys familiar with the World Wide Web? The hyperglobal meganets, right? The interwebs. They were being like created in the 1990s. Now, I was at University of Illinois when Mosaic was created, right? So the first like browsers that actually were like interacting with this. So Alondra Nelson, people like Nalo Hopkinson, you know, science fiction writer, or like Ayize Jemai Everett, who is now a very talented, he's also a published science fiction writer, were part of this listserv that was jumping off at the same time. So there were definitely these conversations that were happening. I wasn't privy to them at the time. But I was always really interested in like the speculative. I was always really interested in like the horrific, the supernatural, the folkloric, you know, these types of things. And so I want to say it was like 2000 and, let me see. It was like 2002, 2003, when I was really interested in this idea of the fixity of stereotypes. Like my background is in listening to clocks. Sorry. I was gonna wait for it to. Okay. No, just saying because it was like you know. Anyway, so I was thinking about the notion of like fixity of stereotypes because any printmakers or design historians or what have you in the audience. So the word stereotype comes from the word stereos, which is the Greek for hard or fixed. Hard or fixed. So the notion of like stereotypes is all about fixity. They don't change. They might change names. It might go from like, you know, Buck to angry black man to thug. You know, you might upgrade them, but they're still the same types of stereotypes. Right. You could say like, you know, angry black woman or sapphire or what have you, right? But they're shifting and changing, and they're very well designed. They function really. They're not. They don't pop out the ground like cactuses. Y'all have beautiful cactuses, by the way. They're intentional, right? And so I started looking at these things, and I was like, well, I think around the same time I had read like Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto, where she kind of talks about the cyborg as an empowering space. You guys know what a cyborg is? Cybernetic organism. Okay, how many people seen Terminator? It's a cybernetic organism, like partially flesh, partially mechanical, right? And so I was thinking about the idea that the mechanical part could be the socially constructed aspects of existence, right? And the fleshy part being how we see ourselves. And so I actually was doing a lot of research on cyborgs and, you know, speculative fiction. And I started thinking about the idea that we are always in conversation with how people construct us and in conversation with how we feel. You know, and so a lot of times, you know, you're trying to slip outside of that stereotype. So I did a series called Matters of the Fact. It was inspired by Frantz Fanon's piece, The Fact of Blackness. And so I was thinking about how these things start to update themselves, but they never really change, right? So I did like 72 illustrations of black cyborgs based off of old like physiognomy photos, you know, like the Agassiz photos, looking at like different images of people like Shaft or like, you know, Foxy Brown and stuff like that, but as cyborgs. And so then a friend of mine, Dana Rush, she's an Africanist, and she said, oh, your work looks really Afrofuturist. And I was like, stop making up words. That's not a word. I didn't know it was a word. And I was like, okay. So when I started doing my research, I realized like this was actually a real space, right? And then I started looking at the fact that a lot of the people that we're looking at as Afrofuturists were coming out of the South. So you guys familiar with Herman Blount? Maybe Sun Ra? That's the name he goes by. He's an experimental jazz performance artist, right? And he was from Arkansas, actually. He's from Arkansas. Maurice White, the lead singer of Earth, Wind and Fire, he was from Memphis, right? Henry Dumas, he was from Alabama, Arkansas. There was all these people, and if you extend the idea of imagining a better future to someone like Zora Neale Hurston or Toni Morrison, or Toni Morrison's not from down south, but they spent a lot of time there, exactly. And she writes about the South. Even more recently, like Janelle Monáe, she was in Kentucky, but I think she's centered in Atlanta, right? You start to see a pattern that a lot of these people, like Medgar Evers or Dr. King, are imagining a better future, right? And I always say, like, the first Afrofuturists was the first slaves that said, like, you know what, we should probably leave here. We should probably imagine. Let's check out this star. Let's get up out of here. Let's follow that star and leave. So the people who migrated through the Great Migration, I look at them as Afrofuturists. They're thinking about the future, right? So has anybody been to King's Mountaintop? The idea of like the mountaintop, where we're gonna be holding hands and all that kind of stuff, right? Do you have a GPS location for that? Like, can you find that on a map? He was utilizing Black speculative culture to imagine a better future. But here's the thing: if you base it off of like Robin D.G. Kelly's work, the Black Radical Imagination, was it Freedom Dreams, right? Freedom Dreams. You have to actually imagine yourself in a better space first before you can actually make any kind of change. So, basing off all that, I started thinking about the South as a revolutionary space. I really started thinking about quilting as a revolutionary act. I started thinking about like canning and preserves that my grandmother used to put away for the winter as a revolutionary act. Survival by any means necessary. What I call chitlin hacking. You guys know what a chitlin is, right? Taking refuse, something that was supposed to be thrown away, and actually remixing that and then reflipping that and making it something to actually survive. That's a survival technology. That's chitlin hacking. To me, that's the South, and that's the future, right? So to me, all those different people who are dreaming of those spaces, they are surviving by any means necessary and bringing us this knowledge from all these different spaces. That's what connects me back to those particular Southern spaces, and how I think that those particular aspects, those writers, those marchers, those men and women that were actually like fighting those particular, that sense of oppression, I mean, the first time that Black Power is uttered is in Mississippi by Stokely Carmichael in Greenville, right? That's the first time it's uttered, 1966.
And the first people to call themselves Black Panthers came
right.
out of Lowndes County,
That's
Alabama.
Right. That's right. And then, of course, Black Panther as a party gets named at 3 months after the comic book is created. Did you know that? Same year.
Know that.
Uhuru, Lieutenant Uhuru, who until fairly recently I thought her first name was Lieutenant. It's Nyota, but that's 1966, and so there was something happening, that was connecting all these different things together, and I think the South has always had something really, if you want to borrow from Outkast, the South always had something to say. Yeah. The South has always had something to say.
Well, you're making me think about Outkast and AT-Aliens in a whole new way now. So thank you.
Yeah. No, have you looked at Regina Bradley's work?
Yes, love her work.
That's my girl.
Yeah.
Red Clay Scholar. Yeah, that's what she studies, and so we work on that kind of stuff together.
Okay.
So we did this conference called Planet Deep South 2 years ago at Jackson, Mississippi. We brought together some of the dopest scholars from all over the country who study Black speculative culture and the South. It was great. It's one of the best conferences I've ever attended. So.
Well, this is really intriguing because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about in the first place was, why do you think that science fiction is a good genre for exploring race? But now listening to you talk, I'm thinking, well, it's because race is science fiction.
Exactly. Exactamundo. So here's the thing. So when I was, that was really Fonzie. I'm sorry about that. I'm such a geek, man. Let me stop. So here's the thing. So when I was at UB, University of Buffalo, I was teaching a class called Applied Semiotics, right? And this is when I'm like deep into, looking at signs and symbols. And I came to the same conclusion. There's this really great piece called Race as Technology. It's by Beth Coleman. And she used to be a professor at MIT. And she's basically said when you take out the the fiction that we're all different, because we're not actually. We're all human beings, right? It functions more so as a technology, an extension of ourselves than anything, right? It's a prosthetic. It has a particular function, right? I was like, whoa, race is actually science fiction then, right? I mean, if you really want to get real about it, I mean, we created each other. I mean, like race and black folk, you know, are created. You know, you've seen this book called Creating Black Americans by Neil Irvin Painter. I was like, what do you mean by this? It's a history book, right? Because after the Emancipation Proclamation, you had people who were equivalent to like a bale of hay literally become human, like instantly, like popped out of nowhere, right? And the other thing, if you want to think about it, you know, being snatched from another space and then being put into a strange land, so to speak. These are the things that Mark Derry was talking about. Like there's these interesting parallels between what it means to be African American in this space that relates directly to science fiction and fantasy spaces. The other thing is like, as powerful and as horrific as Kindred as a narrative is, there really isn't a language to describe the horrors and the traumas of chattel slavery. You know, it really isn't. It's undescribable. So science fiction, fantasy, the supernatural, they give us the language to talk about the monstrous, the grotesque, the abject, the downtrodden, in a way that actually gives us, you know, a sense of objectivity, you know. And so, for instance, when you create a fantasy or something, you can actually distance yourself from it. You can look at it a little bit differently without having to experience it, right? And I think that's the thing. And so, when you look at works like Toni Morrison's work, like Beloved, that's a ghost story. That's a story about trauma. That's a story about a haunted space. This character, the Beloved, is a poltergeist and a revenant. You know, a revenant, an undead body, right? She's both. Right, it's about the physicality of trauma, you know. And the thing that I thought about that was, you guys ever seen Guillermo del Toro's film, The Devil's Backbone? It's a ghost story that's set in like a Spanish mission in a boys' home. It's about a ghost, and he talks about a ghost being like a skip in a record. You know, it's like the instance of trauma with a spirit that it keeps going and going and going and going. And that's what's happening. That's how racism is in our country. It actually is a system that keeps playing over and over and over again because we can't think of anything else, or we caught in it. You know, we relied on it for so long, you know. And how do you talk about those things? You use the fantastic. Yeah.
Well, that's a great segue to talk about Kindred and how you came to adapt this beautiful Octavia Butler novel into a graphic novel.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So it's actually a long story, you know, another long story. I've been a fan of Octavia Butler's work for many years, and so has Damien. It was one of the first things. It was a book that he actually encountered in undergrad. And how many people have read the original book, Kindred? Now, so do you remember the first time you discovered that Dana was black? It's about 33 pages in. You realize that? 33 pages in. That's when it becomes a horror story. When she realizes that she's a black woman in the past, during slavery, she's like, oh my goodness. I remember reading it, I was like, oh, this just became really bad. Because you don't mention her race to start off with, right? So basically, like, Dana, who was a black woman in 1976, and her white husband, at the time that was a really big deal. In some places it still is a big deal. They're moving into a new home, right, in Southern California. And inexplicably, she starts to get taken back and forth through time. Not a time machine. There's no TARDIS. There's no DeLorean involved. You know, it's her being like snatched back through time. And you find out that this little kid, this little white boy with red hair that she has to keep saving over and over again is like her great-great-great-grandfather. And in order for her to live, she has to keep saving him. And so they have this bond, right? And that was just utterly mind-blowing. So in 2008 or in 2009, Beacon Press, who holds the copyright to Octavia's work, they sent out a call to do Kindred as a graphic novel then, actually, as a black and white novel. And so Damien found it. He called the editor, and he was like, we'd be perfect for this. We're both Octavia Butler fans. It totally jives with the work that we do. What do we got to do? And I was still at University of Illinois. And so what ends up happening is we only had a week to submit a proposal. and it was spring break. And actually, as usual, I'm bouncing all over the country. So Damien hurriedly stayed up all night. He wrote a proposal, like an 8-page proposal. I was actually traveling, and I took the proposal, I drew pieces of it, and every time I stopped, I would FedEx artwork back to him. Wow. Right? And it was a lot of work, and we were really proud of it, and we totally failed. Totally failed. Totally didn't get it. Wow. Yeah. Actually, another artist and writer got it, and we was like, okay, well, we're heartbroken, but at least it'll be in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So then fast forward to 2012, Damien and I are talking about our first Black comics book, and I'm on the ground. I got there first. I was at San Diego Comic-Con. I was at the big one in San Diego. And I was taking around my iPad showing artwork for different projects we were trying to get done. They had several projects that were ready to get published. And so I ended up going to Abrams Comic Arts, the publisher of the book. And Sheila Keenan, who is a wonderful editor, you know, I showed her my work. And she was like, oh, my God, I love your work. And I was like, thank you. And she said, it would be perfect for this project I'm trying to get off the ground. And I was like, well, what project? And she said, have you heard of Octavia E. Butler? And I was like, yes, I have. Yes, I have. What project are you trying to get done, pray tell? And she said, Kindred. And I was like Kindred? And she's like, yes, and you'd be perfect for it. And I was like, what? You know, okay. And so what happens then is that when Damien lands and I tell him over drinks, I said, hey, there's a chance that we might be able to do Kindred. She, you know, this editor is really hot to maybe like hire us to do this project. And he's like, what project? And I was like, you know, Kindred. And he's like, Kindred? You know? And so it ends up happening like 5 months later, we're working on the book. And so we didn't decide it. It's like the story chose us. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So we had let it go. We had said, okay, we didn't get it this time. It'll be out in the world. It happened that, you know, the woman who got the project didn't get a chance to finish it up for different reasons. And we were able to get it. And it was kind of rough. It was definitely rough. And, you know, I wasn't ready for the emotional aspects of what it takes to do that. Any comic book artists in the audience at all? Anybody do comics? Okay. I don't like to assume, you know. So we had to do the breakdown. So when you do like a comic book, you're doing, first of all, Damien had to adapt it with Sheila. They had to actually pare it down. They had to get the script together. And then they wanted us to actually sketch out the entire book. It's a 240-page book. And then Damien also did the lettering. So he actually put in the sound effects, the bubbles, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? And so literally he like lettered it probably 2.5 times. And so once you go through the breakdown process, you then have to draw it. And then you have to ink it. You have to put the ink on it. I had to do the colors as well, right? So every time you're doing it, you're making it more and more real. And I wasn't ready for that. Because there's scenes in Kindred that are so powerful that I was literally like crying onto the original art. I was like blubbering. I'm like, no, it's really bad. It was really bad. It's really bad. In fact, the scene where she actually discovers that she's in the past and she's being like, you know, and she's listening to the whipping while she's hiding. Right. Oh my God, it's so traumatic. And I waited till the end to color that piece because every time you're doing it, you're making it more and more effective and more real. I was not ready for that. And also the physical aspects too. It's brutal physically. I mean, sitting for hours and hours drawing anything, you know, is physically taxing. So my wife got me like this different types of like back supports, and you know, I had this aromatic thing that she would heat up with the rice. You ever seen those? So I had the rice thing on my neck. It was crazy. And I could talk more about the process, but that's how we ended up doing it. We wanted to do the project. We lost the project, and the project wanted us to do it. That's the way I feel about it. So.
And now you have plans to adapt more of Butler's work too.
Well, yeah. So what happened was when the book was done, and this is something I've been designing for like 20. Like I said, I was a designer for like 20 or some years, and I do like a lot of graphic design. Mm-hmm. I've never turned in a project where the client didn't have changes. So we actually turned in the book on time by.
Oh wow! See, that in of itself is commendable. Right?
Well, yeah, and it was. I could extend that particular story because I actually injured myself making the book. Like during the black and whites, I actually pinched a nerve and actually had to hire color. Now I understand why artists use color assistants and why they use assistants. You know, my wife had to talk me down. It was real. It was. Damien looked like a corpse. You know, we were up all night working. It was ridiculous. You know, I was inking with Sharpies, and so they so my studio always felt it smelled like Sharpies. So I think I was like halfway in another mind space anyway. It was difficult. And so when the book came out, though, the estate, Octavia Butler's estate, and her family and her agent, they had no changes. I'd never had that happen before, no changes. Wow. And when it debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list for graphic novels. I think right now it's in its 7th printing. We're doing a soft cover of it. And for the most part, I think that we honored Octavia's work. We were very cognizant of the voice that we were trying to use. And because of that, we were able to secure a 2-book deal to do Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. So that's the new.
See some excitement there.
That's the next books. Yeah. So yeah, we're working on those now. Thank you. And we're super excited about it. More trauma, yay! I don't know if you've read those books. Actually, I feel Kindred was actually more traumatic in some ways because we don't know, because Dana never knows when she's going to travel, and I think the dread, the dread in the pit of her stomach that she doesn't know when she's going to happen. Yeah, I think to me it's more horrific than Parables, which is horrific in a different way. But yeah, she doesn't write happy stories. She never wrote like no,
it's not.
It just wasn't in her. She was like, this is how it is. And you're like, ow, please give me more. You know what I'm saying? Anyway.
No, it seems as though you are helping to drive a moment.
Yeah.
Right now that's happening. You know, I'm looking at the Black Panther T-shirt right there. Everybody's buzzing about Ava DuVernay's A Wrinkle in Time. Mm-hmm. What's happening?
Oh, man. Well, I think people are starting to discover that there is such a thing as people of color loving science fiction and fantasy. It reminds me actually a little bit of like the blaxploitation era to a certain degree. I mean, in a cursory manner where it's like, wait a minute, black people make films? They go to the movies? What? You know, we should make more of this thing. Perhaps that. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm a smart ass. I'm sorry. I think that there's been this notion of black folk in our country being attacked by various types of violence, both systemically, the prison industrial complex, various types of brutality against the black body, and I think that brings into contention the idea of what it means to actually have a black future. I mean, I think that black folk having a future is actually still a very radicalized notion to a certain degree. And so I think back in last year, September, I realized that there were a lot of people who were like on the streets marching, who were fighting for different types of against injustices, who were actually writing science fiction, who were actually like thinking about the future and creating like fantasy work, right? Like for instance, one of the prime books is Octavia's Brood. It was edited by Walida Amarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown, who are both activists and science fiction writers who actually pulled together on-the-ground activists who are writing sci-fi. So, and there's other books like I think it was called Baltimore 2048. I forgot the actual date, but it's about the future of Baltimore, Black Baltimore. Around the same time, me and my friend Ronaldo Anderson are putting together this art show that was looking at black speculative culture and graphics, and it was at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It was called Unveiling Visions, and it was like 87 artists from all over the globe imagining, Afrocentric spaces, right? And this is not, devaluing other types of spaces. It's actually saying, you know what, we're here, we're imagining these things, and I said, you know what? Let's just call it what it is. I think it's the Black Speculative Arts Movement. Because to me, a lot of people from the Black Arts Movement were writing science fiction and fantasy. Amiri Baraka was writing sci-fi, Toni Morrison's work primarily to me is speculative. It's magical realism. It's, it's speculative in nature. If you look at like Henry Dumas's work, who was actually killed by an off-duty cop in Harlem, coming from a Sun Ra practice, by the way. He was really close friends with Sun Ra. Right, to me, he was like the almost like the patron saint of what I call the Black Speculative Arts Movement. And we look at like people like Ronaldo Anderson, Maya Crown Williams, Red Clay Scholar, Regina Bradley, Susanna Morris, Kenitra Brooks. There's a swath of like scholars who are studying this work right now, not only in this country but also in internationally. And you have like celebrated writers like N.K. Jemisin, Nalo Hopkinson, Tananarive Due, Stephen Barnes, Nydia Okorafor, who are writing these this groundbreaking work. So you have like this literary movement, but you also have this kind of counter, like, on the ground political movement that are happening simultaneously. And I think that it's come to a head. I mean, I think I've seen it bubbling up for the last decade. I've seen it bubbling up for the last decade, and I think that honestly, one of the catalysts was the presidency of Barack Obama. I think it was. That's one of the things. And because before then, whether you agree with him as a president or what have you, if you didn't see, you didn't see a black president in everyday life, right? You would see them in science fiction and fantasy stories, like Morgan Freeman,
Right.
or like Tiny Lister, or like the brother from 24. You would only see them in speculative spaces, right? And I would even argue that those particular roles, like that Denzel was playing and things of that nature, actually helped get him,
Helped us imagine
what a black president could even look like. You know what I'm saying? Actually, Jabari Asim argues that too in his book What Obama Means, actually. Okay. So that's one particular catalyst. The other one is the democratization of tools of production. So for instance, any of you now can download Photoshop, InDesign. You can get, anybody can publish a book right now online because of the web. Anybody can do that. You can make a film. Right now we have the processing like everybody have a smartphone. If you got a smartphone, you're a movie maker. That's unprecedented. That's crazy. That's more computing power in our pockets than we're on like the space shuttles, right? It's ridiculous, and we take it for granted, right? We take it for granted. So access to those types of technologies, and also the World Wide Web actually connecting all these different geeks and blurs and nerds all over the world now, because you don't have to be alone anymore. It's just like imagine what I would have done in Mississippi if I had the World Wide Web and actually had a community that I could speak to. So that's what's happened too. So I think those are things. The catalyzing force has been like the connectivity of the world now, and you're not alone. And then of course geeks run the planet. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. When you look at seriously, you can deny it if you want to, but geek culture is strong. Shoot. Black Panther just made $1 billion. $1 billion. It's the ninth most highest grossing American film, period, in history. Wow. Right? But black images don't travel. They don't, no one wants to see us be awesome.
It's always been the story.
Yeah, I know, right? Okay, so what's the next thing? I don't know. Anyway. All right, I'm gonna stop talking about that. Was that okay?
I got an opportunity to ask you questions. So why don't we see what the audience wants to ask you? Any questions out there?
Let me look at the time.
In the back.
No, they're recording though, so they're recording.
All right. So great to hear you speak here today. Thank you for being here. I just have been looking at Masters of the Sun, the Black Peas thing.
Oh, yeah.
With, augmented reality. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's any AR in your future, maybe, speaking of technology.
I'm actually hoping so. He's talking about augmented reality. How many people are familiar? Augmented reality? Okay. So basically, augmented reality is a new technology where you can actually create almost anything through like computer coding, through your like cell phones and other types of visual technologies. So what they do is you can actually like have like through pattern recognition, you can have your phone like go over an image and you can see something happening on your phone that's not in real life, so to speak. So I'm talking like movies, music can happen, other types of images. And it's really powerful, and I think that that's pretty amazing. When we were doing Unveiling Visions, we actually were developing an app called The Veil. So when you were in the show, you were going to be able to actually see an entire different exhibition in your phone that you couldn't see with your natural eyes. But our programmer actually became ill, and we weren't able to implement that aspect. Because the notion of like, we were basing it off of Du Bois's notion of the veil, And so we were thinking like, what if the veil actually was an alternative space, an alternative mode of technology, right? So you could like just peel that back and see into a whole other, because the way he writes about it is almost like it's kind of like not necessarily a negative thing, but it's not necessarily the best thing, right? So like, what if it's actually a mode of speaking and making, So we were wanting to use augmented reality for that, but I'm definitely wanting to do other projects with augmented reality. I think that's extremely interesting, and it speaks so much to like just how people view the world anyway, And I want to see that. I haven't read that book. I know the book you're talking about. You're talking about the Black Eyed Peas book. Yeah, I didn't get a chance. I need to pick it up.
So when I do storytelling, which is its own form of art,
that's right.
I'm always in conversation with the culture that the story's from, or if I'm telling a real story, the person's story. So I'd love to hear, what was your internal conversation with Octavia? Oh,
that's interesting. I did feel, and I know this is going to sound strange, I did feel that she was with us. You know what I'm saying? Both Damien and I have talked often about feeling her presence. Or for me, I felt like it was like, you can do it, push forward, that kind of thing. Damien's a white creator, right? Despite his brotherly name, Damien Duffy is actually of Irish descent, right? And so he's always cognizant. Even though we've been working together for 14 years, he was like, he could hear Octavia saying, "Don't you do that, white boy? No. What are you doing?" You know what I'm saying? Yeah, no, it's a whole different. He had a different conversation. We're very cognizant of the different voices that were happening because, first of all, do we have the right to do this story? This is a woman's story. It's a very woman-centered piece. It's a black woman's story. It's about these intersectional ideas that we found very powerful and that we had been talking about in our work for many years. So what gives us the right outside of a contract to do this, right? And so I think that out of reverence for her spirit, we tried to be as open to what she wanted as much as possible. When she was conceiving the book, it was based off of this idea that she wanted people to feel what slavery felt like. She wanted people to actually feel it. And so when you add a visual dimension to that particular kind of charge, right? You have to be in service of that idea, The other thing too is she wanted it to not be so overpowering to the point where it would actually like push people away. So I decided to go with a more cartoony, rough style. Anybody familiar with the artist Kathy Kollwitz from the Second World War? Yeah, so I was really influenced by the German Expressionist movement. I was really thinking about like the Harlem Renaissance. I was thinking about like how those things would be in conversation, with what she would want, The other thing, which was really cool, this is totally tripped out. The Huntington Library actually has her papers there, and so we actually got a chance to speak at the Huntington while a show about her work was there. That was awesome. One of the curators did a talk about Kindred, and on the table was two magazine, like from the 1970s, like two magazine ads. One was this beautiful African-American woman. She had this really short hairstyle. She was a fashion model. She was gorgeous, right? But really, really clearly defined features, kind of androgynous a little bit too. And then there was this white man with white hair, with blue eyes, with these piercing, beautiful blue eyes, right? And he was like a Marlboro man, And as soon as we saw them, we knew that they were Kevin and Dana. And our versions of Kevin and Dana were very close because we listened to what she wrote in the story. You see what I'm saying? Even the house, we try to listen to what she had left for us, So that's how I think we were in conversation. Yeah. That felt great, too, to see that. We're like, that's Dana and Kevin. We knew it as soon as we saw them, Anyway, you had a question, ma'am.
Back here or on which side?
It was ghostly, too.
Oh, then we'll come back?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I don't think my question probably has an easy answer. But one of the things, at one time this morning you said, we're really alike. Like, we are alike. And I understand the paradox, though, that I like to think that we're alike, but as a white woman, I can't know, like, how we are not alike.
Right.
I don't know what my question is, but it's something that I wonder about.
Yeah, that's why race is like this tricky app. It really is more like a technology than anything, or the story of it as well. Because really what it is like, you have to legitimize how certain people are treated, and then you create stories to back it up. And so we're taking care of these people. They're not exactly human. Their culture doesn't matter. These particular these are all stories, And in the African American community, a story is another word for what? A lie. Oh, you telling a story? Stories are lies. And you're a good liar, man. Trickster characters are liars. Like Brother Rabbit, the signifying monkey. They're all like, they're flipping the script. They're teaching us something through lying and storytelling, right? you know, race is a lie. It's not real. But it's also one of the most powerful things ever created. So what I've been studying fairly recently is what I call critical race design studies. I've been thinking about how graphic elements they act as indexes for systems, you know. So for instance, during like Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, somewhere in a municipal guide, there's the exact dimensions and kerning for Jim Crow signage, because these things were municipal. They were actually put up. So yes, I don't know if this answers your question, but it's like, I think about those same things, the paradox of it, right? So for me, it's like, you know, like for right now, I actually have a phone. I have a 6S Plus phone. It's an iPhone. It's old. It needs to be updated, right? It's out of date. It's an out-of-date system. So why is it that patriarchy, ageism, racism, right, all these different systems don't get updated, and who benefits from it? So that's what I'm very curious about as a designer. Because for me, design is not just, oh, I made a pretty logo. It's problem solving. It's problem solving. And so I think that when Du Bois said that, you know, the color line is the problem and of the 20th century, he really wasn't looking far enough, you know. Still a problem. By the way, Du Bois wrote science fiction. You know that, right? W. Du Bois wrote science fiction. They found a piece that he wrote called The Princess Steel 2 years ago when we did this show that he wrote in 1905. He was an avid reader of like science fiction fantasy. Of course, there was other one called The Comet. So what I'm saying is that Afrofuturism as a space, imagining race, imagining different things, we've been doing this stuff for like generations. I mean, for instance, what about Black No More by George Schuyler? That was written in 1931. It's from the Harlem Renaissance, and it's about a technology that turned black people white. It's a chair, right? But phenotypically they look the same. But it was like, and when you went through the process, you'd be as white as that piece of paper, you know. And so what he was doing a satire of race and representation, but he was using science fiction and fantasy to do it. So, you know, I think it is a fantasy, but we've invested a lot of time in making sure that it isn't. So. That's
Hi.
Black Panther. What, you gonna get the?
Oh. Sorry. Hi.
Oh.
So you're a Black professor and creator, and I teach here. I'm getting a PhD here. I write. How do you negotiate all of those things, especially when you're creating in the same field that you teach in, without going nuts?
You know what? I will. I think you have to go nuts. That's the first thing. You have to, because you got to be crazy to try that, right? You know. I don't know. I still haven't figured it out. You have to find a time to do it. I mean, you figure out the balance. You know, hopefully you have like partners or people supporting you to actually feed you and make sure you're taking care of yourself. You know. It's a difficult negotiation. I haven't figured it out yet. I mean, I think that I do better than most because I'm efficient. You know, I worked for a long time as a graphic designer, so I understand like deadlines. I'm very precise. I'm very good at scheduling out projects. You know, and after injuring myself doing Kindred, I really am not afraid to ask for help. You know, I think that that idea of the lone auteur is dead. Like that notion, like I am a genius and I am creating the next great thing. You know, no. You need help. You know, you need help to actually. You need editors. Even with something like Kindred, I mean, we wouldn't have actually done that book if it wasn't for Sheila Keenan. You know, so I think like finding your allies, taking care of yourself, and really, really understanding your limitations, time-wise, and all these things is good. That's served me well. You know, but I'm still trying to figure out the balance. But here's the thing, though. I think that people forget that when you're trying to balance things, you ever seen someone trying to balance when they're walking? Right? You're always in motion. You're always in motion. You're not like really, you know, stoic or stable. You're actually constantly moving. So if you're constantly moving and trying to do all these things, I think that you'll be fine. You know, you just have to know your limitations and be really, really, really honest with yourself what you actually can do in the amount of time. So, is that okay? All right.
That was a good question because I had a similar question. My question for you today would be, you spoke earlier about the importance of Afrocentricity and Africana spaces. As you know, liminal space is kind of my thing. So when you take that in something like Kindred, I hear Sankofa.
Yes.
Going back and forth. Could you unpack a little bit about Africana philosophy and thought and how that influenced Kindred and how it could influence Black space?
Yes. Okay, check it out. So I teach courses. I got real black on stage. So I teach courses in like Afrofuturism and aesthetics. I teach one on Afrofuturism and horror. I teach one on Afrofuturism and comics. And one of the common things that I've seen in a lot of these spaces that are looking at Black futurity is the idea of the ancestors as a type of technology, right? A lot of times time travel isn't according to how we think about these really like westernized ideas around technology. For instance, you familiar with the film Sankofa, right? So it's about a woman who is a model, right? She's a supermodel. She's on a photo shoot, and while she's in Africa in one of those the slave castle spaces, right, she gets taken over by an ancestral spirit, and she actually like time travels existentially, right? It's kind of like what Dana is doing as well. But check this out. Have you seen it? Have you read this book called Captain Blackman? It's by, I think it's John A. Williams. Is it John A. Williams? I always flip it because William Johnson was a Harlem Renaissance artist. Yeah, so it's about a black soldier in Vietnam who gets a head injury, and he also does a thing where he jumps from body to body, right? Yeah. And he doesn't do it through through like a technology. He does it through this kind of existential work, right? Same thing with Stigmata, and I forgot the woman who wrote Stigmata, where the blanket is the quilt is a technology that actually, and she gets possessed by these different ancestral spirits. I came up with this term called Sankofaration, right? So what I did is I took the term Sankofa, which is a West African Ghanaian term. It literally means go back and get it, right? Go back and get it. So notion is like taking something from the past and bringing it forward to show the new generations, right? With the word narration. I think it's actually imperative that it's part of how the culture works, you know, because we, particularly in America, we forget our history. We're good at forgetting history. We might remember like the last episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but we will forget entire generations of history because we're afraid of what those ancestral spirits might tell us, you know? So I think it's definitely part of that, you know. The idea of these Orisha and different types of spirits that are worshipped through African diasporic religions, I think function almost like applications. Have you ever read Count Zero by William Gibson? So he actually utilizes voodoo spirits or the Orisha as computer programs that are existing in cyberspace, right? So the thing about those particular religions that they're not stable. They actually update themselves. If you look at like what happened during the Haitian Revolution, you know, practitioners of voodoo actually created brand new spirits to worship in order to encourage themselves to actually fight against the French and become like a free black nation. They created an entire separate set. You have the Rada and the Petro Loa, right? They're the more active Loa. So they actually respond directly to our circumstances, right? I like the fact also that ancestral knowledge gets passed down through artifacts that we leave for ourselves. That's our stories, right? We've always fought back through narrative, through our dance, through culture, you know, through visual art, through poetry. You know, that's why, for instance, if you look at all the different like black power movements that are happening in our country, there's always an artistic movement that accentuates it. So I think it's vital. That was a really long-winded answer to your question. I'm so sorry. I do that sometimes. But yeah, yes.
We probably have time for another question.
What'd I do?
That's okay. Sorry.
Is this working? Oh,
yes.
Okay. I was listening on Democracy Now! To what's been happening close to your hometown in Jackson, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And I read a number of, I guess they're mostly white, utopian science fiction writers, you know, speculating about the future. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering if, when you were talking about king on the mountaintop and
yes.
having visions of social change.
That's right.
If you thought what was happening in Jackson now, was such a vision, but also maybe was material for somebody like you to write a story about.
That's interesting. I think it's very telling that when we did this really wonderful symposium that I talked about at Jackson State, that you did have like someone like Antar Lumumba coming into power in Jackson, that you see a lot of potential in the space. I definitely think that there is hope. I'm not what they call an Afro pessimist, but I am very much a realist. I think that before it gets better, it's probably going to get worse. And if you look at history, two things that Octavia Butler feared the most, and she's talked about this quite a bit, was the fact that mankind always creates hierarchies, and then mankind always wants to be at the top of that hierarchy. And those are two things that she feared, and that's what she wrote about. Now, when I was at Harvard, I postulated this space called the cyber trap. It was looking at like Southern trap music out of that culture, out of Southern culture, mixed with cyberpunk. And I want to say that most of the time, Afrofuturist writers are attracted to dystopians more so than utopias because they seem more plausible, honestly. I definitely want to be on the USS Enterprise, with my food replicator and my tricorder. I want that future, man. I really do. I really do. But I wonder if we're going to have to, go through a few things before we get to that space. So I hope for the best for Jackson, for my state. I love it. I write about it, But I also wonder if the systems that we put in place are so familiar that we miss the future. That's why I work in horror so much. I think you need to actually deal with the trauma first. You guys familiar with Erykah Badu, the singer? She has a song called Bag Lady, right? And it's like, it's about this woman who's trying to catch this bus, but she's got all this baggage behind her, right? And Mississippi is really good at holding baggage. It really is. It's a haunted space. That's my sunken place. You know what I'm saying? It really is. I got up out of there. I hope that these things change, but we got to let this stuff go. And I hope that will really happen, But I don't know. I mean, I was contacted by Lumumba's administration to maybe do some work around these things. I was contacted to maybe work on a new music festival there, stuff like that. So there's things that are changing, but I don't know. We shall see. I mean, when I went back after grad school to teach at Jackson State, I went there with hope to build something new, and I actually started their graphic design program at Jackson State when I was there. And there's some people who are on the ground who are doing some really great work that I think will hopefully push us into that future. Yeah. So, but thank you for that question, by the way. Thank you.
Well, we are all out of time, but I want to thank John for a really stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.